Well, hello everybody, and welcome to my sixth and penultimate instalment of my series on colour for Emma Connects. And this month I am going to be talking about the colour purple. Now, purple is in many respects a kind of chameleon of colour. A mixture of red and blue. It is made when two ends of the spectrum come together. Now, this might make it the most versatile colour on the palette. It can rove from all but red to all but blue and never cease to be purple. And yet, in spite of those many iterations, those many versions, purple is actually very rare in nature, rather like blue. Few organic compounds can pull off this really quite challenging balancing act on which purple depends, which involves reflecting long and short wavelengths of light while absorbing the narrow range between them. Now, purple's natural scarcity has, over time, forced people to develop really ingenious, really elaborate manufacturing methods to make it, lending the resultant colorants, the purples they made, this aura of mystery and luxury that has never gone away. Now, history's most famous purple is, of course, Tyrian purple, which was manufactured in the Middle East on the Syro-Phoenician coast from as early as the 15th century BCE. Now, the dye was actually made from shellfish, whose shells were crushed, and then some mucus was taken from their gland and then extracted. And this was then steeped in salt water and then simmered in lead vats for a week or 10 days or so. And by all accounts, the cooking process released this unbearable stench. Some people said it was a combination of rotting flesh, garlic breath, and asafoetida. But it did also produce some truly extraordinary colours, ranging from sky blue to deep scarlet to this unbelievably rich and lavish purple. Now, production of the dye was labour intensive. You needed 9,000 or 10,000 individual shellfish to produce just a single gram of the dye. And this made it extremely, staggeringly, breathtakingly expensive. So at the beginning of the 4th century, for instance, a pound of purple dyed silk was priced at 150,000 denarii. That was 70 times more expensive than saffron, more than twice as expensive as gold, and 5 times the price of a male slave. And on these price lists from the early 4th century, there was only one item on that list that was the same cost as purple dyed silk, and that was the price of a lion. And I suppose to put these figures into another kind of context, the average 4th century farmer was earning around 25 denarii a day. So if he wanted to buy just a handful of purple dye, he would have had to work for 24 years non-stop. And yet, for all of its ancient meanings, and it has many, purple is also a colour that's strongly connected to modern industrial society, because one of the very first synthetic dyes to be invented was a purple dye. Now, it was invented in 1856 by accident by an 18-year-old boy in Shadwell, East London. Now, the boy, whose name was William Henry Perkin, he was experimenting with chemicals in his spare room when he created this extraordinary violet liquid that was almost as lovely as Tyrian purple. Now, he later used his father's life savings to go into production, manufacturing a colour that he called mauve. Now, mauve went on to conquer the world. It appeared in clothes, in dresses, on billions of postage stamps, and it made Perkin a fortune. But it also generated, by the 1850s and in the 1860s as well, a massive global craze for purple colours, to such an extent that really new purple dyes and pigments were being manufactured and invented pretty much every single month. And it's funny, when people think about the Victorian world, they usually think of it as being black and white, partly because we know it through black and white photographs. And yet, if you went back to mid-century London in the 1850s and 1860s, you would be staggered by how bright and purple it actually was. And of course, after centuries of hardly any purple in art, it started to flood European art in the 1850s and 1860s. In the paintings of the pre-Raphaelites, you can see these extraordinary purple fabrics. You can see it in fin de siècle painting. And above all, you can see it in the work of the Impressionists. And indeed, here we can see a painting by Claude Monet, painting industrial London choked in purple smog. So a colour that had once been almost impossible to obtain was now almost impossible to ignore. Well, thank you very much for listening. Next month, in the final instalment of my series on colour, I will be discussing green.